My name is Tom Smith. I am a game designer at Roblox. I have been a game designer for many, many years. I worked in board games. I actually wrote the first American rulebook for Settlers of Catan, and then board games had a golden age, so that's entirely me. I got into console games when they started doing 3D, and that went pretty well. I got into mobile games early days, worked on Where's My Water and some other cool stuff. That did pretty well, and then I've recently moved into educational games. So I'm predicting big things in the future. And the big thing that I've been doing for the last maybe 5 years is assessment games, which is why I'm here and what I'm going to talk about. So before I go into that though, I'm also work with the education team at Roblox. I work on promoting Roblox as an educational platform, encouraging people to bring cool educational games and make them on Roblox. So that's a whole other thing. If you want to talk to me about that later, I'm happy to talk about that. But first, who here, raise your hand if you have a good sense of humor. If you have a strong sense of humor, if you're better than normal. Okay, so hands down. Now, who here can tell me what the funniest letter is out of 26? What is it? No, it's actually B, sorry. And finally, would anyone be willing to tell a two-line joke, a really quick joke to the crowd right now? Anyone? Okay, go.
A pirate walks into a bar. But he's got a steering wheel sticking out of his pants. The bartender says, what's the deal with the steering wheel sticking out of your pants? The pirate says, R.H. you're driving me nuts.
And that's one that as a Roblox employee, the trust and safety people will not allow me to repeat. So, quick joke. Okay, so these are all really bad ways to measure someone's sense of humor. So if I was looking to measure someone's sense of humor, there's not a normal test I can pull off the shelf and apply. So I might ask people to self-report on what they think they're good at. I might ask them some questions that I made up that I think are relevant to someone's sense of humor. The letter thing, I actually did find B is a really funny letter when I was working on a Leisure Suit Larry game, and anyway, that's a whole nother story. Or I might ask for people to demonstrate their skill. So these are all ways that you can assess things. And when you're looking to assess something that is not normally assessed, you have to find these sort of creative ways. But the creative way that I really do recommend is assessment games. Games can be built as assessments. Games have always been assessments. When you build a game, you teach someone to do something, and then you assess how good they are at it. So when you play Mario, you are learning how to jump. You're learning how to jump on mushrooms. You're learning how to knock things into the sky. And then the game is measuring how good you are, and if you do well enough, you get to go to the next level. It's an assessment. When you're playing Bee Swarm Simulator, you're being taught a very complex economy that isn't a real economy. It's an economy based on honey and pollen and things. But then your assessment unlocks new areas, unlocks new powers. Combat games have always been very assessment-based. Spider-Man puts you into a situation and won't let you out until you've demonstrated the skill. It won't let you move to the next level. It won't let you unlock the next story piece until you show that you can knock people down with webs, which isn't a very practical skill, but it is a skill. And this is such a thing with combat games that the idea of the boss as the final exam is a very common trope. It's literally a TV trope, that the boss is the final exam, and that is an assessment of the skills that the game has taught you. And so when you're learning these sort of skills, when you're learning how to avoid a natural disaster because there's a volcano and a hurricane and a flood all happening at the same time in a Roblox game, you're not learning traditional skills. This isn't something that a teacher would use in the classroom, but you can use a lot of the same principles to build an assessment that does assess normal traditional things. So there's ways that you can take what we as an industry have learned over the many years of figuring out how to make engaging, fun assessments and apply that to the real world, apply that to real problems that are useful and practical. And teachers have known this for years, centuries, decades. Games in the classroom are often used as a way to engage students with a subject matter, to maybe have some sense of how they're doing, a formative assessment of how they're progressing in their learning progression. And sometimes been used as like more formal assessment, but less common, even in traditional classrooms. And then people have tried to take this into the digital age and build video games around this. But a lot of them are relatively simple, measuring things that we've already measured. I mean, Math Blasters isn't really teaching you a lot, it's really assessing a lot. It's assessing how good you are at simple math problems. And this is great, and like, there are other ways of assessing these things though. Multiple choice questions maybe aren't perfect, but they do a decent job of letting someone know if you're good at math or good at English or good at these sort of traditional subjects. What I'm interested in is subjects that are hard to measure in these ways. There's a lot of skills, a lot of subjects that we're really interested in and that we really need to know in order to move the workplace forward, to move education forward. We want to know how good people are at communication, how good they are at systems thinking, how good they are at creative problem solving. And these are things that people have tried to build in the sort of traditional way, and they haven't had much success. So that's where games can come in. And that's what I've been doing. So we build games that are used as part of the hiring process at Roblox. These games are just one step in a larger process. You're not given the job based entirely on the game, but it's part of that process. And we're not the only company, we're not the only group doing this. There's other games, other people that are building games that are meant for assessment. I'm not going to speak to these exact games because I don't know exactly what they are. I haven't worked at these companies, but they're out there. It's a small but growing segment of the industry. And we started as a startup. We started as a company called Embellis. We worked with McKinsey, the consulting company, and we built some things that are still being used for their hiring process. But then we ended up kind of splitting up between, some of us went to McKinsey and some of us were acquired by Roblox. And so now, today, if there are certain jobs at Roblox, not all jobs at Roblox, that if you apply for, you'll get a screening call with a recruiter, and then we'll send you a link to a Roblox game. And it looks something like this. This is a piece from one of the tutorials. And you'll play a game. And it's a game. We give you a set of controls, we give you a world that you have to understand what's going on and the systems that are involved there, and a goal, and you're trying to do something. And so, we're not building a little multiple choice mini game, we're building pretty much a full puzzle game, strategy game type thing. And this is something that at the end of 20, 30 minutes of playing this, we can say something definitive about your ability on a specific cognitive skill. So we have assessments for creative problem solving, for systems thinking, situational awareness. We've talked about some other ideas that we might do in the future, but we build to that specific skill. And so we don't reuse our assessments. Our assessments are specific to that skill. So if we want to assess something different, we build a different game. And it's a completely different game, but with the same principles. It feels like a game. It's 3D, it's got a lot of different inputs, a lot of different options. It's a very open experience. And we've been doing this for a while now. At Roblox alone, we've done tens of thousands of assessments, and we've gotten some good data. We're very happy with how it's turned out. I am not a cognitive scientist. I'm not a psychometrician. I'm a game designer, so I have to trust these people who tell me that it's good. So our reliability coefficient of 0.93, I am told, is very good. These are things that some of you probably know better than I do in this audience. So I'm going to trust my experts here. That's one of my lessons, is trust your experts. And because of this, Roblox has kind of broadened its hiring funnel. So since we have introduced the assessments into the hiring funnel, we've also made some other changes. It's not entirely due to the assessments alone, but we've been able to open up and hire from more colleges, hire a more diverse pool of candidates. And so we're really happy with that result. We're really happy that this has made the hiring process at Roblox even better. And that's really been the goal, and we feel like even in a couple years, we've only been there a couple years, we're getting really good results. We're going to keep tracking the data and make sure that that continues on and that the employees that have come from this are doing great work. But we're really happy with the first couple years of progress. So most of my talk here is for me to talk about how we do this, the process by which we go about this, and especially from a game design perspective, what challenges we have building assessments that are also games. So mostly this is me complaining about how hard my job is. But to start, if you're like me, this is me, one of the things you like about the games industry is you get to work with a lot of really interesting, diverse, intelligent, creative, thoughtful people. And so that is something that I really enjoy. These are some of the people I work with. And these people have a lot of different skills, a lot of different expertises, a lot of different perspectives. They're really creative people, really technical people, really thoughtful people. And one of the things that we've been learning as an industry, as the game industry, I've been working games 20-some years, in order to get a good product out of these very different viewpoints, you need to create a complex system, a process that allows everyone to work together, everyone to communicate, everyone to work towards a shared goal that has all these different intelligent perspectives in it. And if you think this is easy, I will refer you to basically every other GDC talk ever, because this is hard. These people have very different worldviews. But if you can make it work, it's great. Every game that is shipped, in my mind, is a success because they've worked through these problems, figured out how to make this happen. And now, in my life, we've introduced a whole new set of perspectives. So we add the academic perspective to these already divergent viewpoints, and it's great for me. I enjoy it because I love working with all these different interesting, intelligent people. But it does mean that now we've got some new people at the table that we have to account for in our process and in our systems. And if you've worked with systems, you know that when you add new things, it's not an additive process. You really have to kind of reevaluate the whole thing. Every change you make to the system is going to ripple through everything, and everything is going to require new processes, new thoughts. You're not adding, you're rebuilding. You're starting over and thinking about everything from a new perspective. So that's one of the things I really encourage here is don't look at assessment games or even educational games or any sort of serious game as something that, oh, I'm going to make a game and also do this other thing. It's a whole new beast that you have to figure out on your own. And so we still use a lot of traditional game development tools and processes and techniques. And again, like I said, I've been in the industry for a while. We've learned some things. Like you want to start with a good core loop. You want to start with a good core piece of gameplay that is fun and engaging. And that is still true for us. But I've worked in free-to-play mobile where your core loop needs to monetize well. It needs to engage people. It needs to have people returned for day 2 and day 30 and day 60. These are not things that we think about for assessment games. We don't monetize people at all. There's no money involved. We don't retain them at all. When they play our game, the goal is that they play it once for 20 minutes and never play it again. So our day 2 retention is 0, and that's what we want. So we're looking at our core loop from a very different perspective. Our core loop is all about, are we going to get the scores that we need? Are we going to measure the thing that we're trying to measure? And that's another key lesson throughout everything I'm going to say today is scores are #1 priority for us because that's what our goal is, not traditional games. We still want to be entertaining and fun, but #1 priority is can we score what we need to score? Similarly, prototyping is a great tool that I've used in all sorts of games. Being able to quickly build something to answer a question about your game is so much better than sitting around and arguing about it in a room for a week. And I've done that, but I've found prototyping a much more efficient way of doing it. And for these assessment games, that's even more true. We really need to be putting things in front of people as quickly as possible because everything that we care about, our scores, is happening in their heads. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a minute, so I'll leave that for later slides. Documentation, something that I did a lot when I started in the industry. It's kind of tapered off a little bit, but now I'm back to it. We need to document everything because these different perspectives, a lot of the people that we're working with don't know traditional game development. And so when we describe the game systems, they need to extrapolate the scores out of that. They need to extrapolate what the player's going to do out of the player actions. And before it's built, they don't know what those are going to look like. So we do a lot of documentation. We do more documentation than most game companies I've been at in the last 10 years. And finally, playtesting. Really great tool, the best tool for all game developers to know if your game is working. Also super critical for our assessment games. And honestly, I think for a lot of serious games, you need to put it in front of people to see if you're getting the effect that you want. Medical games, health games, educational games, even more important than entertainment games. And I'm going to talk about this in more detail going forward as well. So, the rest of the talk is me explaining our process. And a lot of this is traditional game development. I'm going to assume that you have some familiarity with traditional game development. I'm not going to spend the time I have walking through that. Again, refer to every other GDC talk ever. But I'm going to try to point out places where it deviates, where we had to change the system, where we had to change the process, and why. And especially places where the game design has to account for different things. So that's going to be the rest of the talk. And the top piece here is kind of a walkthrough of that, and I'll kind of keep that as a guideline for what's going on. Because these are live active assessments that we're using in a true high stakes way for people's jobs, I can't always give you all the details of how we made those decisions. I can't explain exactly how the current active assessments work. So I apologize for that. Where I can talk about those, I will. If I can't, I'm going to substitute in a pretend sense of humor assessment, because I can kind of walk you through the steps that we take with a fictional example. Please don't go building a sense of humor assessment. I don't think it's a great idea. But if you do, come back and tell me, because I'd love to hear how it works. Okay, so our process starts, like you can see here, with the what I call the request phase, the let's figure out what we're going to make. And so you really have to figure out what you want, and from a variety of different perspectives. Yes, people of the right age will get my joke here. And so you have to hit all the sort of traditional game development needs. What's my budget? What's my schedule? What's my team makeup? All of those questions that are true for a traditional entertainment game are also true for us as an assessment game. But then we have to figure out a lot of other things. We have to figure out, what is this going to be used for? Why am I assessing this? Am I assessing this for the hiring role like we are at Roblox? Am I assessing something as part of an educational process? Because there's a big difference between an assessment like ours that is really about the assessment, where the output of it is I have in our case, a binary decision to make based on that assessment. But you can also use assessment in a lot of other ways. And I just, while I'm talking about my experience, I think a lot of the lessons that I've learned apply to educational games. Need to be doing assessment all the time to understand if people are absorbing the information that you're presenting to them. And even if you're not building an educational game in the classroom, you often need to know, are the students learning the thing I'm sitting up here talking to them, I'm lecturing them, I'm having them do little activities. Are they actually learning it? You need to assess that in some way just to know if the class is working. And so games can be used for that. Games can be used for career training. Games can be used for entertainment. Even in an entertainment game, like I said before, you want to do some assessment, and you want to be thoughtful about that assessment and make sure that that's, because even if you're not choosing someone's job or choosing their education, even if all you're doing is choosing if Spider-Man gets to go to the next boss fight, it's still a decision that you want to be thoughtful about. And I want to really be clear too that when I talk about assessment, it's very different than educational games. We really don't want to teach you anything. We want to know how your thought process works. We want to know, when you walk into the assessment, how good are you at this thing? Not, if we train you, can you become better? That's a wonderful thing, and I think there are people doing that with games, but that's not our particular role. So we're looking at pure assessment versus teaching, and there's often a lot of overlap. Like I said, when you're teaching, you want to assess, you want to understand if the learning is happening. And this is basically the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment. So summative assessments are, what do they know? And formative assessments is, how do I help them progress in their learning? So my job is currently all summative. We've talked about potentially in the future working with some job training type things that would be formative, but that's not what we currently do. And then once you kind of understand, here's what my goal is. My goal is to make a hiring decision. My goal is to help my students progress in the class. You also need to understand what is it that you're looking for. If you're teaching a class, you'll have a curriculum. You'll know these are the things that I want my students to understand. But in our case, we're not looking for a specific class. We're not looking for a specific set of knowledge. We're not building coding tests that test how well you understand C++ or Lua or whatever. We're building cognitive assessments that are based on skills. We're trying to measure these things that are a little harder to measure in other ways. So we're measuring, like I said, systems thinking, creative problem solving, something like that. And that is really important to understand what you want to measure. Because it's kind of tempting to just say, well, I'll just measure intelligence. I'll just measure general intelligence, how smart the people are, and we'll hire the smart people. And it seems like a good idea, but it really doesn't work very well. It's hard to define exactly what intelligence is. It's hard to measure it in a very general way. And honestly, for a lot of what I do, that's not what we want. We want to know, are you going to be good at this job? Not, are you smart in general? So we're going to break down what exactly are the skills that are used in this job, how are they used in this job, and then try to measure that. So we really have to break down intelligence into different skills and then define those in excruciating detail. And that's really the next step, is once we agree on, hey, we want to build an assessment with this team, with this size, with this cost, we want to use it as a hiring metric, and we want to measure things that are relevant to that job. Then we get to start moving into the need finding phase, which in my example, for my sense of humor assessment, that would mean going into, starting doing a lot of research. So look at what people have written about a sense of humor. Look at how people have defined it traditionally. Look at experts in the field, see what they've said before. And this is, my examples are a sense of humor, but for any skill, there's people out there who have thought about it, who have thought about how exactly this works. Creativity, systems thinking, everything. And see if there's existing measurements. For a lot of things, a lot of especially traditional assessments, there are some good standards that you can use. The middle slide, the middle piece here, the Next Generation Science Standards, NGSS, is a really nice breakdown of exactly what students should know at each age, in each field of science. If you want to know, what should 8th graders know about biology, it's a good standard to work with. It's not the only one. There's other people who break it down in different ways, but you want to kind of work from that knowledge base of people who have done this before. But at some point, you're going to hit the limits of that. You're either going to be looking to assess something that doesn't have these sort of traditional measurements. You're going to be looking to expand it in a way that's specific for the role that you're hiring for or the class that you're teaching. And then you're going to need to get some experts. You're going to need to have people who understand the thing that you're looking at better than other people. Subject matter experts. So if you're teaching science and you want to build an assessment for that, get some people who understand science. If you're looking at cognitive skills, you want to get some learning scientists who know how those skills work. And the important thing, one thing that I really want to stress, is you don't want these people involved just once. You want these people involved all the way through the process. This is where I'm talking about updating your system and adding new pieces to the system that require you to change the whole thing, because you want these people involved from the beginning to the end. Games are an iterative process. You're going to find things halfway through that require you to rethink how everything works, and you want those people there to be doing that thinking with you. So yeah, don't hire a consultant as a one-week thing where they write up something and throw it over the fence to you and you never hear from them again. If your goal is to really do assessment or education or anything really well, it's not going to work. You can get a really a simple sprinkling of education that way, but if you really want to be creating something that has education at the core, that the heart of it is education, you need that involvement all the way through beginning to end. And so in our case, when we're looking at applying our assessments to a new role, a new job, the first thing we do is spend a lot of time figuring out exactly how that job works. When we first got to Roblox, we spent months just interviewing people and talking to managers and talking to hiring people and talking to people who do the job. And how do you use creativity in your job? What are the skills that you look for when you're promoting someone? You really want to understand what the need is, and not just say, oh, well, general intelligence, or, oh, this seems like it's probably going to require this. You really want to understand the nuances of how it's being used. And so this will give you sort of a profile of, these are the skills that are relevant to this position, and these are the skills that I might want to measure. And the first thing to do is not go off and make games for all of those. Some of those things you can assess in traditional, normal ways. And that's usually going to be a lot cheaper and a lot quicker and more efficient and not scare people. So if you can measure something without a game, do it. Where we usually get involved as a game-based assessment is when there's something that's important to the job that is hard to measure in other ways. So that's where we've identified things like systems thinking and creative problem solving and situational awareness as things that a game can assess better than other things. And it's worth the effort to go through this whole process and build this whole thing. And so we kind of focus in our attention on those places where it's most necessary. And then once we do that, we spend a lot of time thinking that through. Exactly how is it used in the role? Is it used on a daily basis? Is it used occasionally? Is it used in combination with other skills? Is it used by itself? Is it used with time pressure? We really want to know exactly how we want to build the assessment so that it reflects the job and it's a meaningful a meaningful assessment of what the job actually requires. One of the questions we always ask after any test is, did playing this game feel like the things you do at work? Because we do a lot of testing with existing employees, and that's something that we look at closely to see if there's that correlation. And then the outcome of this is going to be evidence statements. And these are concise sentences that say, if you do this, you are demonstrating this skill. And this is something that isn't, we didn't create these. These are something you can find all over the educational field. These specific examples are from the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards that I mentioned before. So you want to kind of create something like this based on your need. So the skill that you're looking to measure, the job that you're looking to hire for, and make these as specific as possible. So this is something I cannot share about our actual assessments. So here's like, for a sense of humor. Is a sense of humor about, can I evaluate whether a joke is good? Is it about whether I can tell a joke? Is it about, can I define why a joke is funny? These are all different sort of subcategories of the skill. And so being able to break down those subcategories and then explain how to demonstrate those. So answering questions might be a way to demonstrate that I understand what is funny and isn't funny. Actually performing might be necessary in order to demonstrate that I can tell a joke and get the timing right and all that. So breaking down the skill in this level of detail is really important. And this is kind of the goal of this whole phase. This whole need-finding phase is usually our scientists, our academics, going off on their own, breaking things down in this level of detail, and then we get to the point where they have broken it down and they switch it over and pass it off to people like myself, the game designers. And we look at what can we put on a screen that will evoke this thought. So if I know that one of my evidence statements is, can they tell if a joke is funny? What can I put on a screen that will make the player think about what is a funny joke or not? And most importantly, click on something. This is the most important thing, because if you're playing the game and you have a thought and you go through the thought process and don't do anything that I can record in telemetry, it's useless to me. As an assessment, I need you to click something. And that's really like the most important thing, and the bane of my existence in my day job is getting people to actually click things. Because when they do, then you can actually go off and create scores. You can go and say, oh, this click means you were demonstrating the skill, and so that's worth this value. The actual math is much more complicated than this. I work with psychometricians who are experts at turning actions into scores and measurements, and they're gonna laugh at me putting a +4 up here. But the basic idea is that the click equals a score, and then throughout the 20 minutes of you playing the game, I can add all those up. I can compute based on all the different actions you took. Ideally, different actions that are reflecting different evidence statements, reflecting different aspects of the skill that I'm looking for, and aspects of the skill that are relevant to the job, and in the case for a hiring assessment. So this is the goal of the concept phase, and the thing that I do that is kind of difficult is figuring out how to get something on the screen that makes the player do the click that is related to the thought. And so we'll start just doing a whole bunch of brainstorming. We'll get a big list of crazy ideas, and we'll kind of do our own brainstorming process. We'll look at existing games, where have we seen this skill demonstrated in other games, where have we seen mini games that we think reflect the skill. If we're looking at a specific skill, we'll break down what games include a sense of humor, what games are relevant to a sense of humor, and this will give us some ideas. We'll look at other ways, non-game uses of the skill, and see if we can gamify them, see if we can turn them into something that works. We'll look at existing assessments. If there are ways that people have measured this skill before, can we make that more engaging and more game-like? And so we'll come at it from any perspective we can, very open, broad brainstorming, and then we'll just start pitching ideas. So we put a joke on the screen and we ask you to measure it, and you have to say if it's a good joke or a bad joke. We give you half of a joke and ask you to finish it. We ask you to complete it. Maybe that's better, I don't know. A card game where you're building jokes out of combinations of nouns, I don't know. You're walking through a 3D environment and the doors you choose to go through determine what is funny and what isn't. This is probably a terrible idea, but it allowed me to put a picture of a duck in my slides, so that's good. You have to build a factory where you're manufacturing jokes. I don't know. We just create as many ideas as we can and do a little bit of self-evaluation and come up with a big list. And we're really looking for that screen to thought to click process. So if we think there's a possibility of that happening, it'll be on the list and we'll keep it around. And this is where it gets a little tricky, because you might think, oh, games have all these great examples of people demonstrating all these skills. But a lot of times, people demonstrate skills in ways that don't work for assessment. So if someone's playing chess and the player makes a move, they move a pawn to a4 or whatever, they might be being really thoughtful about that. They might be a skilled chess player who's put a lot of thought in it, or maybe they're just moving things at random and they don't know what they're doing. As assessment, I need to know the difference between those two things. And if they are being thoughtful, how thoughtful are they being? Are they predicting moves ahead, or are they predicting how many moves ahead are they thinking? Because each of these might result in a different action by the player. And 3 of these may result in the same action, and I don't know which one happened. So there's all these different thoughts happening and all these different clicks happening, and I need to be able to break those apart. I need to be able to say which corresponds to which. So I need to break it down so there's one thought and one action. And this is especially difficult because as a game designer, what I have learned, Sid Meier likes to talk about a game as a series of interesting choices or interesting decisions. And that's great advice. I think he's a smart guy. There's a lot of ways to make a decision interesting. One of the most common ways to make a game decision interesting is to give it these layers. It's part of the sort of standard game designer toolbox, is to say, this decision involves 5 different factors. You have to think about the long term and the short term and what you're doing here. And if it's chess, I have to think about my defense and my offense and the long-term position of the board. And that's an interesting decision. Chess is not a bad game. If anyone here designed it, good job. I think that is good game design. And that's something that I value. And it's not good assessment design, because I don't know which of these thoughts motivated the player's action. As an assessment, I really need to get that one-to-one correspondence. And this is true of almost any game has these layers, has these different factors that go into the decision. If I'm deciding where to collect honey in Bee Swarm Simulator, there's lots of reasons why I may pick a certain field over another one. If I'm mining in Minecraft, there's lots of factors in, why do I want that sapphire block there? Why am I mining it? Is it because I want to build something out of sapphire? Is it because I want to just turn to the right and move through that area? It's hard for me as an assessment designer to know what that thought was. So again, I have to take all these different thoughts and really turn them into one. And there's a few different ways I can do this. I can break up the action into multiple actions. I can say, okay, now click here, and I'm gonna take this click and break it up into 3 clicks. I'm gonna take this rule and break it up into 3 rules. I'm gonna take this action and break it up. I'm gonna take a decision that you were making in our really well-designed card game and say, now there's 2 options instead of 1. Now you have to decide, and you have to tell me what you're thinking when you make the choice. And sometimes this can kind of work. You could do something where after the player makes the decision, you do a follow-up question. You prompt them, tell me why you made that decision. As some of you might have noticed, this is not good UI UX. This is not a good process. If you ask me after I take an action, why I took the action, you're breaking my flow, you're pulling me out of the game. We often have a battle between UI UX and scores in our games. We often have to decide whether to get as much information as we can to get the scores, or to make a good, efficient, clean UI UX. And usually the UI UX loses, because scores are our first priority. We still want to be an entertaining and engaging experience, but if I have to sacrifice a little bit of that in order to get the score I need, we do things where we have information and you have to click to get additional information. As a UI UX designer, that's terrible, but then we know whether or not you read that thing. We know at least you looked at it. We don't really know for sure that you read it, but we know at least you had the potential to read it. And that's information that we can use in the assessment. You can also fix some of this sometimes with design, but it's also hard. So if I was building Minecraft from the beginning, I might say, okay, Sapphire's only used for building. It's never used for crafting. It's never used for other things. This block, I know when you mine this block, you're going to use it for building. Except you might also just be trying to get through there. So I don't really know that. So maybe I have to design around that. Maybe I have to say, the spawn logic knows where to put Sapphire, so it's not in the player's main path. But you can see how this starts to change the game. If you're taking a game that already exists and trying to add an education or assessment or things like this, it doesn't really work, because now I've changed things to the extent that those ripples are going to cause me trouble again. This is why you want to start from the beginning, start with your core loop, and design around your assessment or whatever it is you're trying to do from the beginning. Because this is going to start to change everything about Minecraft. And this is going to make a whole different game. So I've gone through and I've kind of broken up, and I've decided that I've got these ideas that have a single thought relating to a single click. I've now got this nice big list of games that I can start to think about and I can start to evaluate. And so we go through a process of sort of evaluation here. And the first danger sign is if it doesn't have good scoring potential. That's something that we always talk about a lot, and we evaluate all of our concepts first according to this. And we look at our evidence statements, we see which games have the best thought to click ratio. Not exactly measuring it like that, but yes, we basically are looking, and then that allows us to trim down the list pretty quickly, because there's going to be things that are better and worse. And then the ones that are left, we can start to look at additional criteria. The ones in the middle are kind of traditional game development criteria that we look at. Is this game going to be really hard to build? Is this game going to be difficult for accessibility purposes? Does it feel like the right sort of game? We know that our games are often the first game that someone plays as an applicant to Roblox, and so they're really thinking about Roblox, and so we want them to reflect the values of Roblox well, and so that's something we look at. And so some games we can trim based on these, but then the last two are actually really important, and they're more specific to assessments. So it's really important that our assessments are not biased, that no one group of any sort has an advantage in our assessments. And I would not claim that we can remove all bias. Bias is a really difficult thing to pull out. But what we're looking for, our target is that it's fair, that there's no group that is performing better than other groups. And so we check our data meticulously, constantly, before we release, once we release, after we release. And if we see any signs of any irregularities, any group seems to be doing a little better, we immediately take some action and do things. We're testing out a new idea recently. We had some signals for this, and so we went back and redesigned it, and now it's doing a lot better. So this is something we take really seriously. As a game-based assessment, we also have to worry about gamer bias, because we don't want people who are used to playing games to have a preferred status in our assessment. We don't want people who aren't familiar with traditional game mechanics to not get a job. So, that idea I had about going through doors, probably we'd have to reject, because that's a popular game on Roblox, and if you've played that game, you're probably going to be better than someone who isn't. But even a lot of sort of traditional tools in the game designer's toolbox, we have to be really careful about. We try not to use avatars, because avatar movement, avatar control is something some people are more familiar with than others. We don't want someone who isn't familiar with that to be disadvantaged in our assessments. And gamers think that like WASD controls are easy and understandable, and they're not. Like, a lot of people who aren't used to those are going to have trouble just navigating through our worlds. So we tend to do more UI-based interfaces and UI-based navigation. We built an assessment based on modifying a factory. And so we looked at games that use factories and made sure that we weren't doing the same sort of thing. We weren't giving you the same abilities, we weren't giving you the same goals. So even if there's some similarities, we're confident that they're not giving an advantage to people who are really good at Factorio. Other than you're probably pretty smart if you're really good at Factorio. That's a really hard game. But this means, as a game designer, I have to set aside a lot of my traditional tools. I have to look at a problem and come up with a way of solving that problem that makes sense, that is logical, but isn't something that is in so many games that people are going to have an advantage doing that. And then finally, the last big factor that we evaluate our concepts against is the ability to build variations. And variations are really important to us, because we have to worry about cheating. We have to worry about people trying to gain an advantage in our assessments based on things other than the actual skill. And this may sound kind of silly and paranoid, but when we were doing this back with McKinsey, there's a bunch of websites where people were trying to tell you how to beat our assessment. And we were just one company, and it's still a thing. And so in the traditional testing world, in the world of the SAT and all that, it's a big problem. It's a big thing. And so, at some point we hope to be that big, and we want to be ready for that and have the tools in the game already to prevent that sort of cheating. And the cheating can come in a lot of different forms. There's like the direct cheating of like the answer to question 7 is B. This is usually pretty easy to just create a few different forms, and then if I tell you the answer, it might not be the answer that you get. But sometimes you can also give guidelines, give heuristics, give strategies. And this is something we kind of worry about, and we try to be careful with, that the strategies that I can communicate to you are not going to give you a huge advantage. And really, if we can make those strategies more and more complicated, we can get to the point where the strategy that I'm telling you is basically the skill that I'm looking for. So the goal is always that the way to cheat at our game is to learn the skill. And we're fine with that. Like, if that's how you're cheating, good job. And so this is a problem with traditional assessments. They create different forms every year and change it year over year. And you might get a slightly different question, a slightly different phrasing of the same question. And this is something we do as well. So we create different forms for our assessments and give people slightly different versions to make it harder to do the cheating, especially the first type of cheating. But you have to be careful with this, because you don't want one person to get an addition problem and one person to get vector math. And so you have to create a lot of forms, and you have to make sure that they're all equivalent, that they're all the same. And normally, as a game designer, if I'm making a whole bunch of different things to put in front of people, I'm going to randomize it. I'm going to have, roll the dice. It's fun. Your result is a little different. The enemy conflict, the set of enemies you fight might be a little different. Their health might be a little different. But this is another tool in my normal toolbox that I have to throw away, because we need really close equivalence. We need everyone who is getting an assessment to have the same fair chance of success. And if there's even a slightly harder version or a slightly easier version, then that person is not going to have the same experience. They're not going to have the same opportunity to show their skill. So randomness, like real randomness where there's variation in the outcomes, is something that we have to throw away. Equivalence is totally important, because we want everyone to run the same race. We don't want one person to have hills and one person to have curves and one person to have a straight line. So to do that, we have to have a concept that is going to support a lot of variations, ideally variations that are easy to generate. We recently had an assessment that we thought was going to be easy to generate, and it turned out that we needed to do a lot more animation than we thought, and so apologies to Dustin, who is our artist, who I added a lot of work to, because we couldn't figure that out. Okay, so all of these criteria are used to narrow down our set of ideas. And the goal is to get down to maybe 2 or 3 ideas that we think have a good chance of measuring the thing that we want to measure. And then we move into prototyping. And we start looking for the clicks that we are going to assess based on. And really what we want to be doing is watching the thought process to make sure that that's happening, but there's no good way to do that. So the closest we can get, and the best practice we have, is listening. So rather than trying to read their minds, we ask them to tell us what is going on in their minds, and we listen to that. So we spend a lot of time doing think-alouds, where we'll put the game in front of people, and we'll be on Zoom listening to them, and we'll ask them, just tell us everything you're thinking. Tell us what you're looking at. Tell us why you did the thing you did. Tell us what's going on in your head. And so we can get them to start verbalizing, and we can see if those thoughts are occurring. Ideally, we'll get them to verbalize even their deeper strategies and the sort of undercurrent of why they did the thing they did. And this is great because it allows us to verify that the thought is happening, and then we can see if the click happens in correlation with the thought. And that's really the heart and soul of our assessment games. But at this point, we're too early. We don't have the game yet, so we can't put something in front of people. So we take the ideas that we still like, and we start prototyping. And this is something that, like I said before, I've used in all sorts of entertainment games, but here our questions are a little different. We're trying to just get at, is the thinking occurring? And I'm a big advocate for prototypes as throwaway work, for prototypes as getting to an answer as quickly as possible in whatever means possible. So we will literally do paper prototyping on pieces of paper. We will do prototyping in Google Slides, where we have people dragging things around and simulating the actions they're going to take with crudely drawn shapes. Machinations is a tool I've used. If you're not familiar with it, it's a really nice like game economy simulator that we've used to prototype some more complex systems. Roblox is actually a great tool. We've built spaces in Roblox and put it in front of people to see how they would react. And one of my favorite ways to do this is with a little bit of puppeteering. So we'll put something up on the cloud and have the player participating in it, and then when they want to do something, they'll verbalize that, which is a great way to get them to verbalize, and then have the designer in the same application, in the same document in the cloud, make the change as if they were operating under the game logic. And so it's a way of pretending like you have game logic before you've written any code. And it's a way to kind of give the player the experience they're going to have and see if the thinking is occurring and if the actions are occurring really, really early, which is really important for us. Because that allows us to kind of identify if the thinking is occurring and if the clicks are corresponding to the thinking. So we use prototypes to really narrow down to one idea. And once we do that, then we start game development. We start moving into the actual development phase where we're getting stuff done. And this, for the most part, is traditional game development. So not easy, still challenging, but can use a lot of the sort of standard tools and standard practices. We still do a lot of think alouds. We're doing constant play tests with people to verify that the thinking is still occurring the way we want. Even a small change in the UI sometimes can change the way that someone is thinking and the way that they're reacting to things. So we are basically keeping everyone involved all the way through and involved in discussion. Every week we're looking at new think alouds, new playtests with new features, and we're having a discussion with that full team about what we're seeing and how we think we can improve things based on what we've seen. And this is really that system that I was talking about before in action. One thing that we implement early on in the development phase that isn't a special problem for us, so I want to call it out, is the tutorial. Tutorials are hard. Game development in general has gotten better at tutorials over the years. There's some best practices, there's some good GDC talks. And a lot of what I would distill that down to is learning that tutorials are not separate from the game. So it's not that you do the tutorial and then you play the game, it's that you need to integrate them. You need to have the player constantly learning new things and playing around with those things and then assessing how good they are and bouncing back and forth. And different players can take different paths through this. And that's a nice tool in the game designer toolbox that, once again, I don't have access to. Because in an assessment, we really need to make sure that everyone starts at the same place, that everyone has the same information before we assess anything, and then we start assessing things and we don't change it once they've started assessing. So we really need a clear line between tutorial instructions and the test. You don't learn halfway through the SAT that suddenly everything is not what you thought it was, and you have to approach things differently. Because we really need that to be a fair measurement. So we need this clear line between tutorial and assessment. And this is something we've been experimenting with and trying to get the right balance on, because as a game designer, it's really important to me that the player has a chance to play with the system a little bit before they're assessed. And so we don't want to just have a bunch of text explaining the rules and then throw you in the game with no practice with the UI, with no practice with anything. So we've tried a number of solutions. This is something that, in my mind, is a problem we're still working on. Every new assessment, we're making some improvements to the tutorial. Some of those work, some of those don't. So this is something that is an ongoing struggle for us to let the player kind of play with the concept, but still keep it fair so that everyone has the same chance at success. Okay, so at this point, we're back in a normal game development process. We're writing code, we're testing it, we're doing the think alouds, and then at some point, we're kind of done building the game, and now we're just iterating. We're constantly making changes. I call this section out just because it's been really important for us to remember as game developers that iteration usually takes as long as development. Like, getting the game right is often harder than just getting it working. And so this is normal game development, but I still want to call it out, and then we'd go through a normal QA process. We wrap things up, we get things ready to ship. But in our case, shipping is still testing. We start with pilot testing, where we're putting the game out maybe to a few hundred people. And really at this point, we're just checking to make sure things work. We're looking for any sort of red flags, any bad signs in the data. We're making sure that the clicks that we expect are happening and happening in the right way. We're looking that the things that are happening on the screen are getting the result we want, that the scores are happening, and that we're not seeing any weird biases. All the things that I've talked about so far are happening. And that's really the pilot test. And then the field test is basically a bigger version of that, where we're actually now looking at the scores. And are the scores doing the things we want? Is there any bias on any one individual score? Is there any bias across the whole thing? Are the scores actually resolving in a way that we can definitively say something about the skill? And this is where the psychometricians get very involved and do their magic in ways that I don't fully understand, that they're very smart people. You might think, okay, at this point, you've got all this telemetry. You know every click they've done. You know where they've moved the mouse. You know what they've hovered over, what they've looked at. Why don't you just look at everything and just extrapolate out what works and what doesn't? Like, throw it through some AI, see if they move the mouse to the left here, that means they're going to score well. If they click this 3 times, that's going to mean that they're going to score poorly. We've tried this. It doesn't work. The scores that we've created, that we've crafted, that we've thought about, those do pretty well. The scores that we kind of retroactively try to apply, it just doesn't work. There's not a good correlation. We're going to keep looking, because maybe at some point there will be something that will help us realize something we didn't think about. But just using sort of like big data processing methods, it's not very effective. Okay, so once we've done all this, we then go operational, which means the game is out there, the game is being used, people are actually being assessed and actually having a result based on it. It doesn't mean we stop. We're still checking the data. We're still looking at things. We're still creating new forms. We're creating new versions of the same assessment. So, in some ways, we're a live service, to use the game development term. But at this point, it's actually being used, and we've now finished that assessment. We're very happy. So, to wrap up and summarize, first, the most important thing about an assessment game is the assessment. You need to get scores. You need to get clicks that relate to thoughts that happen because of what you've done in the game. Everything else is secondary. And to do that, you need to have a team that is built around your experts. You need to integrate and build a whole new system, a whole new set of gears that have everyone from beginning to end. Which means you have to throw out a lot of your traditional tools as a game designer. This may sound sad for people like me, but honestly, it's part of what I like about this. It's fun for me to have new challenges. I've done this for a number of years. I like solving problems that I haven't solved before. And to do this, you need to look at how people are responding to your game. So you need to put it in front of people, ask them what they're thinking. It's the only way to know that your game is actually working. And then finally, tutorials, especially hard. Think about your tutorial. Be careful with your tutorial. Make your tutorial early and often. So that is assessment games. I thank you for coming. I work on the education team, like I said. I also teach at the local community college. These are all things I'm excited by. If you see me around the rest of the talk, please accost me and talk about these things. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions about anything I said, please go up to the microphones and talk. And then I will go to the wrap-up room after this if you don't get your question in. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, yeah, you mentioned briefly some metrics that you guys are using to track the progress and track the success of this program you guys are employing. I guess what is your key metric to determine whether this is a successful thing to roll out to Roblox and companies beyond that as well?
To be clear, our goal isn't to roll this out to companies outside of Roblox. Our goal is just to use it in Roblox. Reliability is one of our key metrics. That's one that we look at really closely. We just look at score performance. Like each score we're looking at, does this have a good distribution? We want scores that tell us something meaningful about the range of candidates we get. We are starting to look at, now that we've been at Roblox for a few years, we're starting to look at long-term success rates. So people who've gone through and gotten a job, are they performing well? There's a lot of different ways we can measure that. And honestly, the nuances are going to be up to the scientists that I am not an expert on. So what I've just said is about as much as I can say about that. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. For assessment games, do you especially care about making sure that your playtesters are fresh? And if so, how do you find fresh playtesters?
Yeah, so a lot of times what we do is we're using recent hires. So we use people who are in the role that would have gone through the assessment recently, because we can usually get goodwill from people inside the company. And yes, we need them to be fresh. We don't want people who have seen that same assessment going through it multiple times, because yeah, they're gonna have, I mean, ideally they're not gonna have a huge advantage, because our assessment should be based on the underlying skill, not on learned qualities of the individual assessment. But generally, I mean, Roblox is a big company. We have a pool of thousands of people to pull from. So we can usually get enough people from that. Back when we were a smaller company, we would go through a little bit more effort to get in people that were close to the target audience, because it is really important that the testing pool match the candidate pool. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Hi.
Hi. What made you choose contexts that are sort of not as directly related to like it's not a sit at your desk at Roblox simulator that you've got like a factory, some kind of robot thing where you do need to tutorialize them. How did you choose where to go on that spectrum of like most like their job to most fantastical?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion around that. We want something that we feel has the right level of sort of near transfer, where it's similar to what you do at the job, but not exactly what you do at the job. But we also need a metaphor, a theme that it doesn't have people with a lot of existing knowledge, that doesn't have a lot of bias towards, oh, you know, we've used the natural world before, because that's something a lot of people have a small amount of familiarity with and are comfortable with. At Roblox, we're using a little bit more industrial style things that feel kind of, you know, high tech, and that's kind of the feel that Roblox has. But mostly we're looking at things where there's not going to be that bias, and we're not going to have pre-existing expectations. We actually, when we were doing the natural world, we had one biology student take it, and they did terrible because they kept expecting things to match reality, and that caused trouble. So that's part of why I think we moved away from that as well, is we're looking at things where you can't come in and think you already know the answer. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, how do you manage retesting in the case someone applies 6 months later or?
We do identify that, and we try to give them at least a different form. In some cases where appropriate, we would like to give them a different game that measures the same thing, which right now we don't have a full suite of games ready, but we're working towards that.
Thank you.
So yeah, but at minimum, we try to make sure they're not going to have exactly the same answers. So, hi.
Hi. What's the role of sound in an assessment game? Is it the same as traditional, like providing information, feedback, setting mood, or do you just try to leave it out entirely?
So far, we have left it out.
Okay.
For the last couple years, I've been trying to get it in, and I have failed so far. So it's usually on our list of things we want to do, but on the lower side of the list, and then we don't get quite. Because honestly, one thing, long term, I think it's going to be important for accessibility as well. So I think having the ability to have the game narrate to you for people who have visual challenges, that's something that we definitely are cognizant of and working towards, but we have not yet gotten. Partially too because we don't want to assume your technology. We don't want to assume that you have good speakers and audio, and we want to make sure, because of the fairness quality of that's going to be hard for us to ensure. So we want to be really careful when we do add it.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
How do you deal with subjective kind of assessment? Like you said, you know, you're ultimately prioritizing things that are scores. Does that mean it has to be a number? How do you kind of confront kind of that boundary of soft skills?
Let's see if I understand the question correctly. I think we have to boil everything down to a number in some way, because that's kind of like our final output is going to be numerical. So we can batch things in different ways. So we can look at like different qualities of the action that you're taking. If there's more nuanced actions than just a single click that corresponds to a single number. We don't have to have everything be a single direct correlation. We can build more complex relationships if we need to. It also means that there are some skills that are challenging. spent some time thinking about how we would do a communication assessment, and it's tough. It's something we'd like to try at some point because we like tough problems, but there are skills that are inherently more difficult because of that.
Right. I asked this partly because last year I was working on a game that was about assessing creativity,
Yep.
and I was doing all that work to try and help deconstruct into the points you're talking about.
Yeah.
But finding kind of a threshold where we either need an expert assessing the answers,
Yeah.
or we need, massive numbers to really like spread it across. And I was kind of struggling with that challenge of,
Yeah.
do you have experts who are coming in to look at the scores as well? Like, how many scores does a game have within it? Is it just one score?
So a couple of nuances there. You can have experts generate scores for you. It's just complicated and expensive. So we've thought about that in some cases, but usually at Roblox we're looking at thousands and thousands of applicants. So it's not very practical to have people look at each. But for the SAT, for the writing sections, they do that. In terms of number of scores, I probably can't get too specific, but we're looking at least dozens of scores on any assessment when we're asking you to spend 20 or 30 minutes. And generally we're targeting a much higher number with the expectation that a lot of those are going to not work out the way we expected. Gotcha. So we generally start with as large as we can really, and then assume that some are just not going to work and some are going to collapse into the same score basically, where these are directly correlated, so we really can't treat them as two scores. They have to effectively act as one score. And then at the end, we boil all that down. So far, we've generally been boiling that down to a binary decision because we're doing a hiring process. We have investigated more nuanced output feedback to provide to the hiring person or to do for other forms of job evaluation. It's challenging because we're always pressured to keep them as short as possible because people don't want to spend hours doing things when they're applying for a job. But that limits how many scores we can get. Yeah. Thank you. Hi. Are we out? Okay. I will go to the other room if people want to keep talking. I'm happy to keep talking, and if you see me around the hall, please harass me. Happy to keep talking. Thank you.